May 1983, Blackwood County. The wind had been blowing from the southwest for 11 straight days. It was not a gentle spring breeze that carried the scent of lilacs and damp earth. It was a dry, persistent wind, a thief that carried away the finest particles of topsoil from the fields of his neighbors. Arthur Pinter stood on his back porch, a tin cup of coffee held in a hand mapped with the lines of 71 years of work, and watched the horizon. The sky was not blue. It was a hazy, dusty shade of tan, a color that spoke of desiccation and loss. He was a man shaped by the land he stood upon. Arthur was not tall, but he was dense, with a farmer's solidity built from decades of lifting, turning, and walking. His face was a testament to the sun and the wind, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth. He moved with a deliberate economy, no motion wasted. He still wore the same style of denim overalls and flannel shirt he had worn for 50 years, not out of nostalgia, but because they were functional. They worked. He owned his 160 acres free and clear. The deed, signed by his grandfather in 1911, was in a metal box in the bottom drawer of his dresser. He owed no money to the bank, to the equipment dealer, or to the seed company. This financial independence granted him a quiet, profound freedom. It allowed him to watch the tan sky without the cold knot of panic that he saw in the eyes of younger men at the co-op. The problem was water, or the lack of it. The winter had been lean on snow, and the spring rains had never arrived. What little moisture had been in the soil after the thaw was now gone, drawn out by the relentless sun and carried away by the wind. The county extension agent had declared it the driest spring in 40 years. Fields that had been plowed and disked to a fine, dark powder in April were now pale brown deserts. The farmers who had planted their corn into that powder watched as the seedlings emerged, struggled for a week, and then withered, their tiny leaves turning the color of straw. The land was giving up. For many, the season was already a failure before the first day of June. It was a crisis unfolding in slow motion, a silent catastrophe measured in fractions of an inch of rainfall that never came. This was not the first time Blackwood County had faced such a trial. Arthur remembered the stories from his father about the great droughts of the 1930s, tales of dust storms that blotted out the midday sun and buried fence lines. He had lived through the dry spell of 54 and the flash drought of 76. Each time, the response had been much the same. Men plowed deeper, hoping to turn up moisture from below. They bought bigger irrigation rigs if they had the money and access to the dwindling aquifer. They prayed for rain in the stark white churches that dotted the county. And when the rains failed, they took out operating loans to cover their losses and hoped for a better year to follow. The problem was accepted as an act of God, an unavoidable hardship of the farming life. Failure was a possibility one endured, not a problem one solved. The land was simply a stage for this recurring drama of hope and loss. A week later, a new pickup truck, a gleaming Ford F-150 the color of polished silver, turned into the lane of Arthur's neighbor to the east, Bill Henderson. The truck bore the logo of Agri Solutions, a large agricultural consulting firm from the state capital. A man in his late 30s stepped out. He wore crisp khaki pants, a blue polo shirt with the same logo stitched on the chest, and work boots that looked as if they had never been touched by mud. He carried a stainless steel soil probe and a digital tablet in a ruggedized case. His name was Richard Hayes. He was confident, educated, and a firm believer in the power of modern data-driven agriculture. Hayes spent an hour with Henderson, walking the parched, cracked field. He took soil samples, punching the gleaming probe into the earth and bagging the cores in sterile plastic. He consulted his tablet, swiping through weather models and soil composition maps. He spoke with an air of clinical authority, using terms like capillary action, field capacity, and permanent wilting point. His assessment for Henderson was grim but straightforward. The topsoil was critically depleted of organic matter, its structure compromised by years of aggressive tillage. It had no capacity to hold moisture. His recommendation was a costly, but, in his view, necessary intervention. A deep subsoiling pass with a V-ripper to break up the hardpan, followed by a heavy application of a polymer-based soil conditioner and a specific formulation of liquid fertilizer. He presented the plan not as a suggestion, but as the only logical solution. Henderson, his face etched with worry, nodded along, the cost of it all adding another line to his brow. When Hayes was done, he glanced across the fence line to Arthur's farm. He saw a field that had not been plowed. It was covered in a thick, matted carpet of dead and dying vegetation. He saw neglect. Richard Hayes drove his silver truck down the shared gravel lane and pulled to a stop where Arthur's property began. Arthur was in the barn, greasing the fittings on his old corn planter. He heard the truck and walked out, wiping his hands on a red cloth. Hayes got out, his face a mixture of professional courtesy and mild pity. "Morning," he said, extending a hand. "Richard Hayes, with Agri Solutions. I was just over at Mr. Henderson's place." Arthur shook his hand. His grip was firm, the calluses like worn leather. "Arthur Pinter," he said. Hayes gestured with his chin toward Arthur's field. "I couldn't help but notice," he began, choosing his words carefully, "that you haven't turned your soil over yet, getting a late start this year." It was a polite way of calling him lazy or behind the times. Arthur looked at his field, then back at Hayes. "Didn't plan on turning it," he said. The statement hung in the air. Hayes blinked. "You mean you're not planting this year?" "Letting it go fallow." He saw this as the only possible explanation for the state of the field. "No," Arthur said. "I'll plant." Hayes was genuinely perplexed. "Through that?" he asked, pointing at the thick mat of rye and vetch that lay on the ground. "How do you expect to get a seedbed in that mess? You'll need to plow it under, disc it a few times. Even then, with this drought, germination is going to be next to impossible without significant soil amendments." He was trying to be helpful, to offer his expertise to this old man who was clearly making a terrible mistake. "I'll manage," Arthur said again. The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Hayes saw a stubborn, backward old farmer, a relic from a bygone era, and he felt a pang of sympathy. "Well," he said, retreating to his truck, "if you change your mind, here's my card. We have financing options available." He drove away, shaking his head at the quiet folly of it all. He would use Arthur's field as a case study in his reports, an example of what happened when growers ignored modern soil science. The story of the encounter spread, as stories do in small communities. It was told and retold at the Blackwood County Farmers Co-op, the social and economic hub for the area's agricultural life. The men gathered there in the mornings, drinking coffee from styrofoam cups and leaning against sacks of feed. They were good men, hard-working men, but they were also men trapped in a system. They spoke of crop prices, weather forecasts, and equipment breakdowns. Bill Henderson shared his conversation with Hayes, speaking of the expensive polymer treatment as a grim necessity, a last-ditch effort to save his crop. The consensus was that Hayes was sharp, that he knew his business. Then the conversation turned to Arthur Pinter. "Saw that fancy consultant fella stop at Art's place," one man said. "But he got an earful of silence," another laughed. "Art hasn't listened to a new idea since the invention of the rubber tire. Still running that old two-cylinder John Deere." The men murmured in agreement. They saw Arthur's unplowed field not as a different method, but as a sign of giving up. "It's a shame," Henderson said, his voice low. "That was good land his father worked. Art's just letting it go, planting into a mess of weeds. He'll be lucky to get his seed back." They pitied him. They saw his refusal to plow, his rejection of the experts' advice, as the final, stubborn act of a man out of time, a man farming his way into oblivion. His isolation was complete. He was not just apart from them. He was in their eyes wrong. That evening, Arthur did not think about the man at the co-op or the confident young consultant. He sat in his worn armchair, the one his father had died in, and looked at the wall. Hanging, there was a framed photograph from 1948. It showed a younger Arthur standing next to his father, Thomas Pinter. Both men stood in front of a field of corn that towered over their heads. Thomas had his hand on Arthur's shoulder, a rare gesture of physical affection. Arthur remembered that day, that year. It had also been a dry year. Not as bad as this one, but dry enough to stunt the neighbors' crops. Yet their own corn had thrived. He closed his eyes, and the memory came back, not as a hazy recollection, but as a sharp, clear scene. He was 16 years old. The drought had settled in during July. The creeks were low, and the ponds were shrinking, their edges turning into cracked mudflats. Every day, he and his father had watched the sky, hoping for clouds that never formed. One afternoon, his father had led him not to their fields, but to the woodlet at the far western edge of their property, a patch of old-growth oak and hickory that had never been cleared. Thomas Pinter was a man of few words, much like Arthur had become, but when he spoke about the land, his words carried the weight of Scripture. He knelt down, his large, scarred hands brushing away the layer of fallen leaves. "Look here, son," he had said. He scooped up a handful of the dark, rich earth from the forest floor. It was cool to the touch, clumping together in a loose, fragrant ball. It smelled alive. See that? See how it holds its shape? See all them little white threads? That's life. Then, Thomas had stood up and led him back to the edge of their neighbor's cornfield, a field that had been plowed every spring for 50 years. The soil there was different. It was pale, almost gray, and baked hard by the sun. Thomas scraped at the surface with the heel of his boot, loosening a small amount of dusty earth. He scooped up a handful. It was warm and gritty. He held his two hands out to Arthur, a clump of forest oil in his left, a sprinkle of field dust in his right. "Now watch," he said. He opened his hands and let a gentle breeze, much like the one blowing today, pass over them. The dusty soil from the neighbor's field vanished, instantly carried away. But the dark soil from the woods mostly remained, a few small particles flaking off, but the core of it staying in his palm. "The plow is a useful tool, Arthur," his father had said, his voice quiet but intense. "But it is a wound. Every time you slice it through the earth, you are wounding the skin of the land. You're letting its blood, its life, bleed out into the air. A wound can't hold water. It scabs over and hardens. But the earth under those trees, it ain't been wounded. It has a skin, a living skin of roots and rot and life. And that skin holds the water in. That was the principle. It was simple, powerful, and it had formed the bedrock of Arthur's understanding of the world. The soil was not an inert medium for holding a seed. It was a living entity, and his job was not to conquer it, but to steward its life. This knowledge was not merely an inherited memory. It was a written record, on a shelf in the small farm office. Next to dusty equipment manuals and tax records sat a series of 12 thick, oilcloth-bound ledgers. These were the Pinter farm journals, started by his grandfather, continued by his father, and now maintained by him. They were the physical manifestation of over a century of observation. Arthur took down the volume for the years 1945 to 1955. He opened it to the entry for August 1948. His father's handwriting was a neat, methodical script. He had recorded the rainfall for that month, 8 inches. He noted the condition of the neighbor's crops, stunted, firing from the bottom. Then he detailed his own. He had not plowed the entire field that year. He had experimented on a 10-acre plot, planting his corn directly into the residue of the previous year's clover crop. He had noted the soil temperature, the earthworm count, the way the ground soaked up a brief thunderstorm instead of letting it run off. The entry concluded with a simple summary. The unwounded ground holds the water. Yield on the 10 acres was 30% higher. It was all there. Data, not from a tablet, but from a lifetime of careful watching, recorded in pencil on paper. These journals were Arthur's most valuable possession. They were a conversation across generations, a testament to a different kind of science, one based on patience and partnership with the land itself. The next morning, Arthur did not go to the co-op for coffee. He rose before the sun, as he always did, and after a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, he went to the barn. He did this quietly, without fanfare or announcement. His actions were not a performance for his neighbors or a rebuttal to the consultant. They were the simple, logical next step in a process he had been planning since the previous autumn. His decision had been made months ago, guided by the wisdom in the journals and the feeling in the land. The drought did not change his plan. It only sharpened its necessity. His primary tool was not a massive air-conditioned tractor with a dozen hydraulic levers. It was a 1958 John Deere 720, a diesel two-cylinder that made a distinctive, rhythmic pop-pop-pop sound. His father had bought it new, and Arthur had maintained it himself for over 4 decades. Every gasket, every hose, every wire was known to him. It was a simple, powerful machine, and he trusted it. Attached to the tractor's 3-point hitch was not a plow or a disc, but a strange-looking implement he had built himself. It was a roller crimper. He had constructed it from a 48-inch diameter steel water tank, salvaged from an old well project. He had filled the tank with water for weight and welded a series of blunt, quarter-inch steel blades onto its circumference in a chevron pattern. It was not designed to cut, but to crimp and crush. His other key piece of equipment was his planter, a 4-row Allis-Chalmers unit from the 1960s that he had heavily modified. He had removed the fertilizer boxes and added a set of heavy-duty, notched coulter wheels up front. These wheels were designed to slice through thick residue, clearing a path for the double disc openers that would place the seed. It was a homemade no-till planter, built 20 years before the big companies started mass-producing them. His tools were old, but they were not obsolete. They were adapted, refined, and perfectly suited for his specific purpose. With the sun just beginning to burn away the morning haze, Arthur started the old John Deere. The pony motor coughed to life, and then the big diesel engine turned over with its familiar percussive rhythm. He drove the tractor to the edge of the field. The field was not bare earth. It was a dense, waist-high stand of hairy vetch and cereal rye. He had planted this cover crop mixed the previous fall, after he had harvested his soybeans. The rye, with its deep, fibrous root system, had spent the winter preventing erosion and scavenging for nitrogen deep in the soil profile. The vetch, a legume, had been fixing atmospheric nitrogen, creating a free, natural source of fertilizer. Now, in late May, their life cycle was ending. The rye was shedding pollen, and the vetch was covered in purple blossoms. This was the precise moment to act. He lowered the heavy roller crimper and put the tractor in gear. The machine moved slowly, deliberately across the field. The steel blades of the roller bent the tall stalks of rye and vetch, kinking their stems at several points. The weight of the roller crushed them, terminating their growth without uprooting them or chopping them to pieces. Behind the tractor, a thick, green carpet was laid down flat upon the soil. It was a slow process. The tractor moved at a walking pace. Pop, pop, pop. The engine sang its steady song. He worked in long, straight lines, back and forth from one end of the 80-acre field to the other. It took him 2 full days. He was not disturbing the soil. He was laying a blanket over it. As he worked, his neighbors watched. Bill Henderson, standing on his own barren field that was now coated in a thin, crusty layer of the expensive polymer Hayes had recommended, saw Arthur's strange activity with a sense of weary confusion. It looked like he was trying to bale a field he had already let go to ruin. Men driving by on the county road slowed their trucks, squinting at the sight. The news traveled back to the co-op. "You won't believe what old Art is doing now," one said. "He's rolling down all them weeds, just flattening them. Not plowing, not disking, just rolling them flat." The consensus was that he had finally lost his mind. The drought had broken him. The pity they felt for him was now mixed with a genuine concern for his sanity. Richard Hayes made his weekly rounds, checking on the fields where his company's products had been applied. He drove past Arthur's place and stopped his truck. He saw the flattened mat of green and shook his head. It was agricultural malpractice. He made a note on his tablet. Pinter Farm, 160 acres. Complete crop failure expected. Owner refusing all modern inputs and practices. Field covered in unterminated cover crop, creating allelopathic and nitrogen drafting issues for any subsequent planting. He was documenting the failure he was so certain was coming. The dramatic irony was a tangible thing, hanging in the dusty air between Arthur's methodical work and the complete incomprehension of all who watched him. After 2 days of rolling, the field was transformed. It was no longer a stand of green vegetation, but a seamless, fragrant mat of mulch, 4 to 5 inches thick, lying on the soil surface. Arthur let it rest for a day. He walked out into the field and knelt down. He pushed aside the newly laid blanket of rye and vetch. The soil beneath was dark and cool to the touch. It was damp, while his neighbors' fields baked in the sun, losing moisture with every passing hour. His own soil was protected, shaded, insulated. He could see the earthworm middens, the tiny piles of castings that signaled a healthy, active biological community. He dug his fingers into the earth. It crumbled easily, full of aggregates, the small clumps that create pore space for air and water. It smelled sweet and earthy. This was the living skin his father had spoken of. The next day, he switched implements. He unhooked the roller crimper and attached his modified 4-row planter. He filled the seed boxes with a short-season corn hybrid, a variety he had saved his own seed from for years, selecting for drought tolerance and vigor. The process of planting was even slower and more deliberate than the rolling. He drove the John Deere at a crawl. At the front of the planter, the sharp, notched coulter wheels sliced a narrow, clean slit about an inch wide through the thick mulch. They cut through the rye and vetch without disturbing the surrounding mat. Directly behind the coulters, the double disc openers widened the slit in the soil just enough to allow the seed to drop. A seed tube delivered a single kernel of corn into the moist earth, precisely 2 inches deep. Finally, a pair of angled press wheels at the rear of the unit gently closed the slit, ensuring good seed-to-soil contact. It was an act of surgical precision. He was not tilling the soil. He was barely disturbing it. He was creating a perfect, protected environment for each individual seed. The mulch layer would do several things. It would prevent the sun and wind from evaporating the precious moisture in the soil. It would suppress weeds, as most weed seeds would not have enough light to germinate beneath the thick blanket. And as the summer progressed, it would slowly decompose, releasing its stored nitrogen and other nutrients directly to the roots of the growing corn plants. It was a closed-loop system, elegant and efficient. It required no expensive chemicals, no heavy applications of synthetic fertilizer, and, most importantly, very little water beyond what was already stored in the soil. He finished planting in another 3 days. The field looked bizarre to any conventional farmer. It was not a clean, dark expanse of tilled earth. It was a pale, straw-colored carpet, marked only by thin, faint lines where the planter had passed. It looked like nothing was happening. It looked like a field that had been abandoned. Arthur knew better. He knew that beneath that protective blanket, in the cool, moist darkness, life was stirring. The work was done. Now he had to wait. His days fell into a familiar rhythm of observation. Each morning, he would walk the perimeter of the cornfield. He carried a small trowel. He would stop at random spots, 50 paces in, 100 paces in. He would push aside the mulch and examine the soil. It remained moist. He would check the progress of the seeds. On the 5th day, he saw the first signs. The corn coleoptils, the protective sheaths of the emerging shoots, were pushing their way toward the surface. By the 7th day, the first tiny, pale green spikes of corn began to poke through the mulch layer into the sunlight. They emerged into a world free of competition. On Bill Henderson's field next door, a carpet of thistle and pigweed was already emerging alongside his struggling corn. A new battle Henderson would have to fight with expensive herbicides. Arthur's field had no weeds. The mulch was doing its job. 2 weeks after planting, a weather system moved through the region. It was not the deep, soaking rain everyone prayed for. It was a brief, violent thunderstorm. For 20 minutes, rain fell in hard, driving sheets, and then it was over. The sun came back out, hotter and more humid than before. On Henderson's field, and on the other conventionally tilled fields in the county, the result was devastating. The hard, crusted surface of the soil could not absorb the sudden deluge. The water pooled, then began to move, sheeting off the slight inclines, carrying with it the precious topsoil and the expensive chemicals that had been applied. The ditches along the county road ran brown with the lifeblood of the land. Arthur stood on his porch and watched his own field. The rain fell on a thick mat of mulch. There was no pooling, no runoff. The blanket of rye and vetch acted like a sponge. It absorbed the impact of the raindrops, preventing the soil from sealing over. It soaked up the water and held it, allowing it to slowly, gently percolate into the soil profile below. Every drop of that precious rain was captured and stored. An hour after the storm had passed, the ditches alongside Arthur's property ran clear. This was the first undeniable sign of success, a sign visible to anyone who cared to look. The difference between the two fields, separated only by a wire fence, was stark. Arthur's field had drunk the rain. Henderson's had shed it. A few of the men from the co-op drove by that afternoon. They saw the erosion on Henderson's land, a familiar and disheartening sight. Then they saw Arthur's. They saw the mulch, dark with absorbed moisture, and the complete lack of any soil movement. They did understand the mechanism, but they could not deny the result. The usual chatter of pity and mockery was replaced by confused silence. Something was happening on Arthur Pinner's farm that did not fit with their understanding of the world. A few days later, Richard Hayes made his rounds. The storm had caused problems for many of his clients. The runoff had carried away much of the fertilizer he had prescribed, and the subsequent baking sun had created a crust so hard that some of the corn couldn't break through. He was documenting the damage, preparing reports that would recommend a second application of fertilizer in a pass with a rotary hoe. As he drove down the county road, he saw the deep, new gullies carve into Bill Henderson's field. He sighed. It was a setback. Then he looked across the fence at Arthur's property. He slowed his truck, then pulled over to the shoulder. He got out and walked to the fence line, his polished boots now covered in a fine layer of dust. He stared. Arthur's corn, now a healthy, vibrant green, stood 6 inches tall, poking through the straw-colored mulch. There was no erosion. There were no gullies. There were no weeds. The ground looked stable, solid, and alive. He looked back at Henderson's field, at the pale, struggling corn seedlings fighting for space with the weeds in the cracked, eroded soil. He looked again at Arthur's field. The contrast was absolute, irrefutable. His mind raced, trying to process the visual data. It contradicted everything his textbooks and his corporate training had taught him. Unplowed ground was supposed to be a compacted, weed-infested mess. Planting into heavy residue was supposed to result in poor germination and nutrient lockup. An old man with a homemade planter was not supposed to be outperforming a multi-million-dollar agricultural science company. Richard Hayes stood at that fence for a long time, the certainty draining out of him, replaced by a profound and unsettling curiosity. For the first time in his professional life, he realized he was looking at something he did not understand at all. The drought reasserted its grip. June bled into a hot, dry July. The initial promise of Arthur's corn began to look like a fluke to the skeptics. They reasoned that without more rain, his crop would surely fail, just like everyone else's, perhaps even more spectacularly. The corn on the neighboring farms began to show severe signs of stress. The leaves curled inward during the day, a desperate attempt by the plants to conserve moisture. The lower leaves began to fire, turning yellow and then brown from the bottom up as the plants cannibalized themselves for nutrients and water. By mid-July, many fields looked like they would not produce a single viable ear of corn. Arthur's corn, however, continued to grow. It did not grow with the explosive vigor of a crop in a perfect year with ample rain, but it grew steadily, consistently. The leaves remained open and green, even during the hottest part of the day. The mulch layer was the key. It was now a bleached, silvery tan color, and it kept the soil beneath it remarkably cool. While the surface temperature on Henderson's bare soil could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit, a soil thermometer pushed through Arthur's mulch registered a stable 75 degrees. This temperature difference drastically reduced moisture loss and protected the delicate ecosystem of microbes and fungi that were busy breaking down the mulch and feeding the corn's roots. The system was working. It was sustaining itself. The climax of the growing season arrived in late July with the critical pollination phase. For corn, this is the moment of truth. The tassels at the top of the plant must release their pollen at the same time the silks emerge from the tip of the ear. Severe drought stress can disrupt this timing, resulting in barren, useless ears. Across the county, tassels emerged and shed their pollen on silks that were not yet present, or silks that had already dried up. The window for success was missed. On Arthur's farm, the timing was perfect. The tassels puffed their yellow dust into the dry air, and the pale green silks below caught it. Pollination was a success. He walked his rows and saw the silks beginning to dry and turn brown, a sure sign that the kernels within were beginning to form. Harvest came in October. The county was reeling from the worst yields in a generation. The mood at the co-op was somber. Men spoke in low tones of crop insurance claims and meetings with their bankers. Bill Henderson brought in his harvest first. His new, massive combine crawled through the sparse, withered stalks. The yield monitor in the cab told a brutal story. He averaged 45 bushels per acre, less than a third of what he needed to break even. It was a financial disaster. The county average, as the numbers trickled in, settled at a dismal 60 bushels per acre. Then came Arthur's turn. He fired up his old John Deere combine, a model from the early 1970s that he kept in perfect working order. The machine was small by modern standards, but like all his equipment, it was reliable and paid for. He started on the north end of the field, the steady thrum of the machine echoing in the crisp autumn air. The stalks were shorter than they would have been in a wet year, but they were thick and strong, and each one held a single, well-filled ear. As the grain auger filled the old gravity wagon he pulled alongside, the result was immediately, visibly clear. The corn was pouring in. He did not have a digital yield monitor. His method of quantification was older and more direct. He counted the number of full wagons he took from the 80-acre field. He knew from decades of experience that a full wagon held approximately 250 bushels. When he was finished, 3 days later, he had filled 35 wagons, with a little left over in a 36th. He sat at his kitchen table with a pencil and a pad of paper. 35 wagons multiplied by 250 bushels was 8,750. He added the last partial wagon, another 100 bushels. A total of 8,850 bushels from 80 acres. He divided 8,850 by 80. The math was simple. 1,106 bushels per acre. In one of the worst droughts on record, he had harvested a yield that would have been respectable in a normal year. His input costs were a fraction of his neighbor's. He had paid for his seed, which was minimal because he saved his own, and the diesel for his tractor for 3 passes over the field, planting the cover crop, rolling it, and planting the corn. He had bought no fertilizer, no herbicides, and no expensive soil conditioners. The success was not just agricultural. It was profoundly economic. It was absolute, quiet, and undeniable. 2 days after Arthur finished his harvest, the silver Ford F-150 pulled into his lane for the second time. Richard Hayes got out. He was not the same man who had visited in the spring. The crisp confidence was gone, replaced by a look of deep humility. He was not wearing his company polo shirt, but a simple work shirt. He walked up to the porch where Arthur was sitting, cleaning a set of spark plugs. Hayes stood silently for a moment, holding his hat in his hands. "Mr. Pinter," he said, his voice quiet. "I saw the elevator receipts at the co-op. I saw your numbers." He paused, searching for the right words. "I came here today to say that I was wrong. Completely and fundamentally wrong. I looked at your field, and I saw everything my education taught me was incorrect. And I watched it produce one of the only profitable crops in this county." He looked Arthur directly in the eye. "I don't understand how you did it, but I was hoping you might be willing to teach me." Arthur Pinter looked at the young man. He saw no arrogance left in him, only a genuine desire to learn. He set down the spark plug he was cleaning and stood up. He did not smile, but the hard lines around his eyes softened slightly. "Words don't teach this," Arthur said. "Come on." He led Richard Hayes not to the house or the barn, but out to the harvested cornfield. The ground was covered in the residue of the corn stalks, mixed with the decomposing mat of the rye and vetch from the spring. It was a messy-looking field to a conventional eye, but Arthur saw it differently. He knelt down, and Hayes knelt beside him. Arthur dug his hands into the surface layer. He pulled back the corn stover and the old mulch. Underneath, the soil was still dark and aggregated. It was teeming with earthworms. "This is it," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. "This is the whole thing." He picked up a clump of the soil. It held together. Your science, your products, they're all trying to fix a problem that starts with the plow. For 70 years, my father and we learned to stop creating the problem in the first place. He explained the principle his father had taught him about the living skin of the earth. He described how the cover crops acted as armor against the sun and the rain. He explained how their roots created channels for water to penetrate deep into the soil profile. He told them how the worms and the microbes were his real workforce, turning the mulch into fertilizer, building soil structure for free. You don't feed the plant, Arthur said, repeating the old wisdom. You feed the soil. The soil knows how to feed the plant. It's been doing it for a lot longer than we've been driving tractors. He then led Hayes back to the small office and took down one of his father's journals. He opened it and showed him the decades of handwritten notes, the rainfall records, the successes and failures. He was sharing the source code of his farm, the legacy of observation and respect that had been passed down to him. The explanation was not a lecture. It was a quiet, factual testimony. Richard Hayes spent 2 hours with Arthur that afternoon. He left a changed man. The neat, orderly world of his spreadsheets and chemical formulas had been shattered and then rebuilt on a foundation of something much older and more complex. He went back to his office at Agri Solutions and began to write. It was not the report his superiors were expecting. He detailed the catastrophic failure of the conventional, high-input systems across the county during the drought. Then he dedicated the second half of the report to what he called the Pinter method. He used his scientific vocabulary to describe what Arthur had shown him, translating the farmer's wisdom into the language of his industry. He wrote about biomass mulching, in situ nutrient cycling, and enhanced soil macrofauna activity. He documented the yield results, the input cost savings, and the dramatic improvements in soil water retention. He concluded the report with a radical proposal that Agri Solutions should fund a 5-year study, creating a new research division dedicated to low disturbance, biologically based farming systems. He was, in effect, arguing against the very products his company sold. He knew it could cost him his job. To his surprise, it did not. As senior vice president, a man who had grown up on a farm himself, read the report and saw the undeniable truth in the numbers. The company's current model was based on selling solutions to problems. What if, he reasoned, they could sell a system that prevented the problems from occurring? The proposal was approved. Richard Hayes was put in charge of the new Soil Health Initiative. His first act was to drive back to Blackwood County and offer Arthur Pinter a consulting contract. Arthur politely declined. "I'm not a consultant," he said. "I'm a farmer. But you're welcome to come and watch." And so, Richard Hayes became a regular visitor to the Pinter farm, not as an expert, but as a student. He brought other agronomists with him. They came with their probes and their tablets. But this time, they came to learn, not to instruct. The knowledge was beginning to ripple outward, adopted and translated by the very institution that had once dismissed it. Years passed. The memory of the 1983 drought faded, but its lessons did not. Arthur Pinter continued to farm his 160 acres in the same quiet, methodical way. He grew older, his movements slower but no less deliberate. His grandson, Leo, began to spend his summers on the farm. Leo was a quiet, observant boy, much like Arthur had been. He followed his grandfather everywhere, from the workshop to the fields. He learned the names of the cover crops, the sound of a well-tuned engine, the feel of healthy soil. One cool autumn afternoon, Arthur sat with Leo at the kitchen table. The scent of coffee and cinnamon filled the room. Arthur had placed one of the old oilcloth journals on the table. It was the one his own father had kept. He opened it to a page filled with his father's cursive script. "This is the most important tool on this farm," Arthur told the boy, his finger tapping the page. "More important than the tractor, more important than the combine. Because this is where we remember. A man's life is short. The land is old. It remembers everything. These books are our way of listening to it." He showed Leo the entries from the dry years, the notes on what worked and what didn't. He showed him the first mention of using rye as a cover crop in 1946. The journal was the enduring symbol of their family's pact with the land, a physical object that held the accumulated wisdom of generations. The landscape of Blackwood County began to change. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The fall after the Great Drought, a few of Arthur's neighbors had planted cover crops. They were hesitant, planting only on their worst fields, but they were trying. The sight of green fields in November, once a rarity, became more common. The practice of no-till planting, once seen as Arthur's strange eccentricity, was now a topic of serious discussion at the co-op, promoted in pamphlets distributed by Richard Hayes's initiative. Arthur's success was no longer a remarkable anomaly. It had become part of the local lore, a foundational story for a new way of farming. The sight of his unplowed field, covered in its protective blanket of mulch, was no longer strange. It was simply the way the Pinter place was farmed. It was the new normal, a quiet testament to a truth that had been there all along. One spring morning, Arthur stood by the planter, watching as Leo, now 16 years old, carefully calibrated the seed depth. The boy worked with a focused intensity that reminded Arthur of his own father. "Why do we set it to 2 inches, Grandpa?" Leo asked, looking up from his work. "Why not 1 or 3? Arthur didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the edge of the field and pushed back the mulch. He picked up a handful of the dark, moist soil. "Because at 2 inches," Arthur said, "the seed has enough moisture to get started and enough energy to reach the sun. But it's also deep enough to be safe from the birds and the late frost." He let the soil run through his fingers. "But you don't learn that from a book. You learn it from feeling this. Every year, it's a little different. You have to listen to what the soil is telling you." Leo nodded, a look of deep understanding on his face. He had not just learned the method. He had understood the principle behind it. He was learning to read the land. In that moment, Arthur knew the knowledge was safe. The legacy would continue. The torch had been passed. The old John Deere 720 sat in the barn. Its green paint faded, but its engine sound. The journals sat on the shelf, their pages filled with the steady accumulation of years. They were not relics of a forgotten past. They were tools for a sustainable future. Some things did not become obsolete. They simply waited patiently for people to remember why they were built, why they were written, and what they had to teach. The land had never forgotten how to hold water, how to nurture a seed, how to sustain life. It had only been waiting for its stewards to stop wounding it and to remember the simple, profound wisdom of its living skin.